All right. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. This morning, we're looking at Acts chapter 20. Come up behind me. Everything's good. Acts chapter 20 is where we're at this morning. So Paul is on what we call his third missionary journey. He doesn't call it that. And Paul has accomplished so much in and around Ephesus and the general province of Asia, of what we call sometimes Asia Minor. It's modern-day Turkey, the western shores of modern-day Turkey. Paul had accomplished so much, but there was this violent response from the people in the city. We saw in the last few weeks, and the violent response was because Paul challenged their way of life. And I don't mean like you shouldn't be gardening this way. He means like you shouldn't be going to the temple for prostitution type of change. And when you change, especially the monetary power structures of a city, so that the people making the idols don't have anybody to sell them to anymore, suddenly you have conflict. And that conflict threatens to crush the nearly 3-year-long effort that he has put in here at Ephesus. And so, Paul decides to leave Ephesus and continue on. And the disciples who he had taught and he warned with tears, he gathers around him for one last time because he's about to leave them in a persecution that's going to start there. And so I can't even begin to imagine the bitterness of the farewell that Paul is giving to these people. Everywhere around him looks dark. Behind him, where he's leaving Ephesus, where he's just been for 3 years and had so much success, and now persecution is starting. In front of him, he sees darkness because he keeps having these visions of he knows that he's not going to be able to come back to Ephesus. And the reason is because he's on his final journey in life. Ultimately, what awaits him is death. So everywhere he looked, it was dark. But that doesn't stop Paul. And so Paul now sets his face, is the metaphor that's used in the Greek. He sets his face. Wherever we turn our face, that's where we're going to start walking, right? He sets his face towards the opposite shore across the Aegean Sea from Ephesus. And so he travels first by foot, and by boat, up to Troas. Does anybody know what the former name of Troas might be? Might sound familiar if you've watched some of the Greek movies recently or know about the Iliad and the Odyssey. The former name for Troas was Troy. And so Troy is where we get the famous story of Achilles and all the famous events that happened there. We don't really know what Paul's emotional state is when he gets there, but he's expecting to meet Titus, who's coming from Corinth, who is, if we look on the left side of the map here, that's modern-day Greece, and Corinth is over there in the word that says Achaia. And Paul was expecting him to be there, and he wasn't. And so it's at that point in the story here today, we're gonna see it, but he tells us this about this pent-up sadness in his heart. And he writes it in 2 Corinthians. Remember I said during this journey that Paul's on right now, this is when we know that he is writing the letter of 2 Corinthians in the Bible. Because he says in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, and a door was opened to me in the Lord, I had no rest in my spirit. Okay. Normally, when we say a door was open to me, that means good things. A door was open to me. I came to Alaska. A door was open to me. I got this job. A door was open to Paul, and he had no rest in his spirit. Because I found not my brother Titus, but took leave of them and came away into Macedonia. Macedonia is north of Greece. So on the far left, where it says Philippi and Neapolis, up on the very top there, that is even modern day Macedonia. It's still called Macedonia. So Paul has this heavy, heavy heart. And one of the main reasons he goes to Macedonia is for collecting a gift. And of course, that's mentioned again in 2 Corinthians, where he says, when we had come to Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were afflicted on every side. Without us, outside of us, there was fightings. Within us, there was fear. 2 Corinthians chapter 7. First half of 2 Corinthians is it's a downer to read. It's a real downer. Why did Paul have to leave Macedonia the last time? It's because he was being chased out of town by the local authorities every time he stopped, right? Now he's going back to visit, and he gets no king's welcome. They are fighting him. The townspeople are fighting him again. He says, I have no rest. But finally, we see in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, there's a big change. It's all not so nice, kind of down the first half of 2 Corinthians, but the second half of 2 Corinthians is much different. And I would put to you, that's because he found Titus. And so finally, in Acts chapter 20, Paul meets up with the long overdue Titus. And he not only meets up with him, but Titus arrives with good news. Good news from Corinth, the other place that he stayed almost 2 years in. And so there's a big change in the tone of the letter of 2 Corinthians there. And he says this there at the end of 2 Corinthians chapter 7. He says, God, who is the comforter of those who are lowly, comforted me by the coming of Titus. And not by his coming only, but also by the consolation with which he was comforting you. By telling us your desire, your earnest desire, your mourning, your fervent prayers, your mind towards me, so that I rejoiced even more. So Paul gets this really good news. And so, like I mentioned, two of Paul's most powerful letters come out of this time period. He was writing 2 Corinthians while he was walking around here in northern Greece, before he winds up in Corinth. When he winds up in Corinth, here, mid-chapter, not mid-chapter, like verse 6 of chapter 20, he wrote probably his greatest masterpiece of all time, Paul did. He wrote a letter to a church he had never been to. Do you know which one I'm talking about? Romans, the letter to the Romans. And so Romans is the letter where he announces and he explains the gospel message of Jesus being Lord and how that was the foundation of all of his plans in life. It was the foundation for all of his work and the mission and the unity of the church. And all of that happens in the 3 months that are mentioned here in Acts chapter 20 and verse 3. Let's read that. Well, let me back up. Chapter 20, verse 1. After the uproar was over, there's already been an uproar. After the uproar was over, Paul sent disciples and encouraged them, and after saying farewell, departed to Macedonia, that's northern Greece. And when he had passed through those areas, offered many words of encouragement, and he came to Greece, and he stayed there for 3 months. And the Jews plotted against him when he was about to set sail for Syria, So he decided to go back through Macedonia. Now, if you look here on the chart, the southern part of Greece, so on the far left, he was just going to take a ship back from there, straight back over to Antioch, way on the far right. But he says he was prevented from doing that, so he gets back on his feet and walks another couple hundred miles back to Philippi. Because that's, what you do in those days. Maybe you're lucky you have a donkey, right? So by the time we get to verse 6, sorry, let me read verse 5 because this is kind of important. Verse 4, he was accompanied by Sopater, son of Pyrrhus, from Berea. We heard about Berea. They were the ones who were noble, right, who studied the scriptures. Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica. Those were people who were associated with the synagogue there. Gaius from Derbe, Timothy and Tychicus and Trophimus from the province of Asia. These men went on ahead and waited for us in Troas. Paul is taking a bunch of people with him on this journey. And we sailed away from Philippi after the festival of unleavened bread. In 5 days, we reached Troas, where we spent 7 days. Did you notice that? We spent 7 days. Luke has now joined, the author of Acts, has now joined back up with the crew. And so, why do we need 7 people going with Paul on this trip? These are all recognizable names that we saw earlier in Acts. Why does he need 7 people going with him? Why were 7 people? Paul said in 1 Corinthians his purpose, though, during this time period. And one of his purposes there in 1 Corinthians chapter 16 was to take up a collection from all the churches to take to the saints in Rome where there was a famine, right? And so his intention was to do things honorably. What's the word we use nowadays? That was not a rhetorical question. What's the word we use when we take somebody with us? Accountability. These were like accountability partners. These were men who could take the money with him. I highly doubt they needed 7 people to carry all the money because it was so heavy. But these were people that he could take with him and to tell the other saints in other places and encourage them. But so that he could do things honorable in the sight of men. That's 2 Corinthians chapter 8. And to not give any sort of highway robbery a possibility. And so he goes to Troas, and it says he spent 7 days there. And in verse 7, it says, on the first day of the week, we assembled to break bread. Breaking bread, right here. I highly doubt they did a little pinch and sip like we do. They probably did have a meal. That's another story for another time. But they broke bread together, and Paul spoke to them since he was about to depart the next day and kept talking until midnight. And then we get the story of Eutychus. I'm going to kind of skip over the story of Eutychus because I want to focus on this breaking of bread on the first day of the week. Because for 2,000 years now, Christians have come together on Sunday to observe what we call the Lord's Supper. Some people call it the Eucharist. There's lots of different names for it. And so let's ask a few questions. Why on Sunday? Well, literally it doesn't say Sunday here. In the Greek, it says, on the Sabbaton we came together. Sound familiar? Sabbaton, Sabbath. It's not the word Sabbath, but it means literally the first of the Sabbath. Just remember, this is written in Greek, but what I just quoted was a Hebrew word. So it's a Hebrew word that had been loaned into Greek, and Greek had picked it up and started using it. Kind of like English uses tons of words from other languages. So in Greek, you have the Sabbath. That's 7, the 7th day of the week especially. In Hebrew, Sabbath literally just means 7. All right. The Sabbaton, though, is the first of the 7. So it's a metaphorical way of saying the first day of the week. That's why our translations, many of them say in verse 7, on the first day of the week we assembled. So, for 2,000 years now, Christians have observed the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. Why not on the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week? Right? Well, in verse 7, we see this reference to worship on the first day of the week. So let's look at the biblical evidence for what we call the Lord's Supper. And let's start with when the church began. When the church began, they continued steadfastly, it says, Acts chapter 2, in what? They continued to verse 42. Does anybody know it off the top of their head? And they continued steadfastly, what? They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. It was the reason that they came together on the first day of the week, on Sunday, was to take of this remembrance, this memorial, these symbols. So the disciples came together on the first day of the week to break bread, it says here in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7 and 2:42. And that breaking bread is a reference to the Lord's Supper, and we know that because Paul reiterates that where we just read in 1 Corinthians 11 and 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and 1 Corinthians chapter 16. So he says it several times. And there's several other signs when we're looking for a weekly observance in the scripture. The church at Corinth was coming together, it says in 1 Corinthians 11, to eat the Lord's Supper. Like that was the purpose that they came together. And so one of the main reasons we come together on Sunday is to worship, but it's also to take of the Lord's Supper. And so Paul breaks bread with them, and now he moves on from Troas. Have you ever been on vacation and your brother lives right next to the beach, but you don't want to go to see your brother? You want to go to the beach. Right? That's pretty much what happens here. Paul plans to bypass Ephesus, the place where he spent 3 years, and is going to give this great heartfelt goodbye here for the rest of the chapter, starting in verse 17 through the end of the chapter. And so he, instead of going there and getting caught up and being sucked in, he calls for the elders from Ephesus. So there's a group of men who come. And he's hoping to arrive in Jerusalem by Pentecost. And so it's like the beach analogy, or it's also like when you try not to look somebody in the eye, someone you know and love, so that you can leave the party, so you can walk out the door. Kind of the same thing, right? Paul goes to Miletus, and he invites the elders, which are 30, 40 miles away, to come and visit him. Now, this word elder that's used, let's look at Acts chapter 20 and verse 17. It says, now from Miletus he sent to Ephesus and summoned the... Does everybody's Bible here say elders? Yeah? He summoned the presbyters. That's the presbyteros, is the Greek word there that's used. And so we have these names that we use for these offices in the church of men who serve. And there's 3 different words that are used in the Greek, but they all refer to the same office. There's not an office of presbyter, an office of pastor, an office of bishop, an office of elder. And how do we know that? The way we know that is here in Acts chapter 20, he's talking to one group of people, and he uses all 3 words to refer to the same group of people. So there aren't 3 different offices I'm not a pastor, first of all. Let me just explain. I'm not a pastor. I am a preacher. I'm a teacher. I feel like I don't meet the qualifications to be a pastor, first of all. Second of all, every time you find the word presbyteros, you'll notice the S on the end in Greek that makes it plural. They're always mentioned in the plural. There's never a single one person leading a church. That just doesn't happen in the New Testament. So elders, there should always be a group of them for accountability, like we talked about. All right, let's get back to our off my rabbit trail there. Paul is going to review his history of being with them, his service, his teaching in Ephesus. He had given, and he had given, and he had given, and he had received many blessings from them as well. He had received their love. He had received their affection. He had received their support and their friendship. And these are models that we can follow for our own relationships in our own lives. Many homes were opened to Paul so that he could live in them. Paul had lived out the message of the gospel as he understood it, right? That message of God's grace that he says there in verse 32 that I read. Remember, we were reading it during the scripture reading. It says, now I commit you to the word, to God, and to the word of his grace. The word of his grace, the message of his grace is not just some abstract theory that I can believe in. It's not a theory. It's a way of life. It's an image-bearing way of life that we were created in the image of God to reflect him, right? And it's to that message, it's to that way of life now that Paul commends them. Yeah, right there on the left. Either way, I'll get you to the bathroom. There's two bathrooms, one right in the entryway, and then one in the kids' room in there as well. She'll find it. It's to that way of life that Paul is commending them. And so he is commending them in the care of these elders. And these elders, in their care, is what Paul calls the sheep. The sheep that now need feeding. They need leading. They need caring for. They need protecting. They need shepherds. They need poimen to take care of them. Poimen is the Greek word for shepherds. That's the other word here that Paul uses for them. It's the word that's also translated into Latin as pastor. They are not pasteurizing them. They're not heating them up, but they are leading them. It's a little science joke there for you. It's to that way of life that Paul is commending them, right? And so that Holy Spirit, who's led Paul halfway around the known world and used him in these many extraordinary ways, has now made these men overseers. He's made them, the third word is guardians. He's made them episkopoi. Sound familiar? Like Episcopal Church, right? And so Paul is not talking to a singular leader of this group. Right? The group was a group of elders, verse 17. It's plural. And they were supposed to act as shepherds, plural, over the flock. And the task of a shepherd is what? It's important, because if you don't have a shepherd, the wolves get to the sheep, especially the sheep that we have today. And so the task of the shepherd is an important one, but as a metaphorical shepherd over these people, it's a solemn one, I would say. That God gave his own son, Paul says, to die a shameful, sacrificial death so that he could purchase this flock, he says in verse 28. Let's look at that. Be on your guard for yourselves and for all the flock, the poimeno, which the Holy Spirit has appointed you as overseers, episkopoi, to shepherd, poimen, the church of God. Shepherds are to keep watch because there's wolves prowling around. It's one of the reasons why many of us who are transplants here, who were not born here, was there anybody born in Sitka in this room? Oh, Lauren. Oh, I guess your sister too, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Jonah and Neo.
No, they were born Juneau.
Yeah, me and Jonah. I think we were born.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So Sitka is a very transient place. A lot of people don't come here and live here forever. It's there's lots of rain here, lots of reasons why. But where was I going with that? I lost my train of thought. Sorry. Shepherds, right? Oh, wolves prowling around. Many of the reasons that we have moved here is because there are wolves prowling around. Here in Sitka, we were talking about this. You can have your kid bike down the street without fear. I mean, you probably don't want to be on the main street, but that's just because they're going to get run over. Like, I'm not saying there's no problems here, but there are the amount of crime here is much more limited than other places. And so we have shepherded our family and brought them to safe pasture, metaphorically, here in Sitka. And we are supposed to keep watch, and shepherds, elders of the church, are supposed to keep watch because there are wolves prowling around, right? We saw Demetrius, the little guy who made idols in the last chapter that stirred up the whole city against Paul, got him kicked out because he wasn't making as much money. Demetrius, who's sore about his business, is like a wolf prowling around. And so when Paul talks about putting on the armor of God in his letter to the Ephesians 6, he wasn't messing around. We often think of those things and we teach them in Bible class and we have these little cartoons and things, and that's important. But he wasn't messing around. He was saying people are going to come after you. And even more worrying was that some of the sheep and even some of the shepherds may turn out to be wolves in disguise. And so we need to check everything that I say, everything that anybody else says against the standard here of the Bible. Because this is the truth. This is the way of life. Those attacks may not come in the form of a direct conflict. It will most likely become in the form of distorting truth, though. The greatest heresies don't come by somebody saying, "Oh, I deny God exists," or something like that. Most of the time, the church will see what that is. But it comes about by deception. And unfortunately, or fortunately, however you want to look at it, we're fortunate that news can spread so fast now. And so when somebody commits a sexual crime against a young person in a church, we can now pick up the phone and tell other people and warn them to beware of this person. Unfortunately, that means we now know every bad thing that happens anywhere. There's two sides to that. But for Paul's teaching here, he was warning them of their future. He warns them to fulfill their duties as elders, to be aware of this coming, the churchy word that we use, I call them churchy words, is apostasy. And they need to address that coming apostasy. That is the falling away, the people who are not going to do what God called them to do. And so from Paul's teaching here, we can learn a lot. We can learn the duties of an evangelist. That is the duty of the person who takes the evangelion, the gospel. That's the Greek word for the gospel, evangelist. He's somebody who tells the good news. We can learn a lot about the person like Paul who is telling the good news. We can learn about the duties and the limitations of elders. They're limited to shepherding the flock that is among them. And we can learn about the dangers of the apostasies here, the falling away from the truth, and how to address those things. But I think more importantly, Luke writes this down here in Acts chapter 20, all these things that Paul has done, because he wants us to see the importance of selfless service. This is what Paul is doing. His entire life is built around giving himself up for the service of God, for taking the good news, the gospel message, out into the world. The world that is so broken by sin, by wars, by crime, that there is another way to live. And that the love that is behind that new way of life should be evident in us, is what Paul is trying to say. That love ought to be self-evident and live in the brothers and sisters. Should be an emotional bond. So what can we take away from this? We can take away that, well, let me just back up. Let me just read the slide here because I want to talk about this. I already mentioned it once here, but let's talk about it again. I want us to think about how we live our lives. How do we carry out the work of our own lives? Do we take the danger of apostasy seriously? Do we look to God and His Word? Or do we look to maybe me or the TV preacher or somebody else to tell us what's right? We need to look to the original message that God gave us. Don't rely only on me. I'm just a resource. Do we remember what Jesus said about the blessedness of giving over receiving? I didn't go over that for time-wise. I skipped that point. And are we developing the sort of love for one another that we see here in Acts chapter 20? Paul is on his knees sobbing with these elders because of their emotional bond that they've had together for 3 years. And now Paul knows that he's never going to be able to come back. But that doesn't stop Paul. The spread of the gospel in the first century was a team effort. And so Paul continues to teach others like I am teaching you all. Because I am not just the only person who does the work of the church here in this community. I am training you. It's not just the first string, like the apostles or the preacher who gets to do all the work, right? But maybe the second string has to be called up. And that's what I'm doing here with you guys. I want to encourage you to take the good news of Jesus and tell somebody else. We need to be transparent in our dealings, like Paul was transparent. If we need accountability partners, we need to do that. I have an accountability partner right now. He's not here today, but we are going to the gym 3 days a week. And if I don't make it, I'm going to hear about it. He keeps me accountable. Whether it's money, whether it's some sort of other temptation in your life that you need accountability for, Paul wants us to be alert. He says in verse 31, therefore be alert, remembering day and night for 3 years. I never stopped watching out for each one of you with tears. Be alert. Stay awake. I commend you to God and the word of His grace. But but he's going to work through us. God and his grace will be seen through us. If you're waiting for a miracle to happen, it might happen, I don't know. But God works through us. Our part as we are disciples is to work in his good creation here on earth. Is to not be like the disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. We're not supposed to fall asleep at the wheel. That's the lesson for this morning on Acts chapter 20. Next week we'll look at Acts chapter 21. It's good to have everybody here this morning. We'll see y'all guys. We'll see y'all next week. Let's grab our songbooks and turn to number 538. I say that because I'm recording